This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host, Barbara Hinske. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. We don't have a guest today. It is the two of us, and we are going to talk today about choosing between an approach to publishing as an independent author and why we made our choices to go the independent route, and why I might be reconsidering mine. Not might be, I am. Not entirely, but at least for this upcoming book, and the benefits of that, what it has involved, because it's been a lot. And so I don't think this is a topic we have talked very much about. I think with our first interview with Karen Oden, where we talked about how she went about getting her agent, we may have touched on this a little bit. But I don't think we've talked about it in depth and provided our own reasonings for doing the way we have. So
yes.
Let's do that. Let's start with you, and talk about when you started writing, or I guess got ready to publish. Yeah. Why did you choose to be an indie author as opposed to pursue traditional publishing?
So I published my first book at the end of 2012, Coming to Rosemont. And at that point, how old was I? I was 58, I guess, maybe. Anyway, no, I was 59. Well, at any rate, I was old. So I thought, and I read all the stuff about how to find an agent, how to query, and then you get an agent, and then, they look at your book and have you make changes, and then they submit to publishers. And I thought, I'm just not going to live long enough to get through this process. And I just didn't know whether it was any good or not. So I went ahead and self-published it. And, sold a few in the beginning to my friends and family, got some nice reviews, but then it started to slowly build until I had a BookBub featured deal in July 4th of 2014. And that's when it absolutely took off. Oh, I know. And then, so published December of 2012, I went to the Tucson Festival of Books, which is a big festival, in February or March of 2013. So the next year, I'm a brand new novelist. I'm sharing a table with another novelist. We're splitting the expense. I just am there for the fun of it. We were lucky because we were right by the food court, so lots of traffic. My husband was with us, and he's a wonderful salesman. So he took it as a challenge. He would look at somebody and say, okay, see that gal coming down here? She's going to buy two. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? And he hooked him in and he sold him, and he was very good to me because he'd say, well, you might want to consider talking a little bit differently about your book. So he coached me in a nice way. And by the time I was done, we ran out of all. I took 500 books, sold them all.
Holy cow.
Yeah. By Sunday morning, we left early. And then learned later that I was the top selling debut novelist, including all the trad published people, at that book festival. So I thought, okay, well, maybe there's something to it. And then I've had some traditional things later on. We'll get into that, but that's how I put my feet on this path, and glad I did. How about you?
Well, I have a follow-up question before we talk about me. Yeah. In 2012, the resources that were available to authors who wanted to indie publish were very different from what they are now, because now there is a glut of information. Yeah. And it is an industry unto itself. Yeah. So how did you learn enough in 2012 to be able to do it in a way that was professional and effective?
Yeah. And, that was quite a task for sure. I spent a couple of years, including much of the time after I self-published Coming to Rosemont, reading blog posts and just reading stuff on the internet, like 1 to 3 hours every day. I'm not exaggerating, just to educate myself. I mean, fortunately, now there are lots of authors with good courses and things that give you the straight skinny on all of that. But my first version of Coming to Rosemont, I formatted it with like a line a line break between each chapter because I'm has some visual issues and I like to read that way, and found out that that was crazy. So I had to go back and reformat it. So I certainly wasn't immune to making rookie mistakes. I also I also paid about 5 grand for a package of services that were marketed to me by someone who is credible, and they would set me up on all the different Reddit and all those different social media sites or whatever they're called, and then do a blog tour and all kinds of stuff. I think they did absolutely everything they said they were going to do, although I had to really check things and hound them because they farmed it out to people I think they probably found on Odesk from overseas. And
Mhm.
um, yeah, I had to really keep my thumb on that to make sure I got what I paid for. I think that all of that sold absolutely no books, none, none. So it was 5 grand that I wasted, but I did give it a try. And then I learned that for the most part, some of the, at least back in the day, the service providers who would do those things for you just weren't effective in terms of book sales.
Well,
Yeah.
that makes sense to me. Because so I have had a podcast now for 3 years, 2.5 years for my first podcast, Lawyerpreneur. We've been doing this for 6 months now. And there is a significant difference in the tone of emails I get from authors themselves who are interested in being on the podcast that I've hosted versus the publicist or PR firms who are reaching out on behalf of authors. And so I don't know whether it's the personal touch or whatever, but there's a difference. And
Yes.
so that does not come as a surprise to me, um, that it didn't move the needle. And I know of a number of authors who have used publicists, and
Mhm.
um, they can get more. There's also a lot of ways that authors can get more reviews without selling more books, and so there's a lot that goes along with that. But I don't want to get distracted. So,
Right.
um, that authenticity in the marketing, where you sold 500 books in person, or where you
Yes.
have started book club Facebook groups, and where you can actually engage with people and create relationships. That's the things that's going to drive book sales over time and create that fan base. Because I can't tell you the number of things that I have tried that haven't been effective. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the
Me
things
too.
that
Yeah.
any author is going to try are not going to move the needle. But you don't know what works for you until you put it out there.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Um, and what works for me may not work for someone else. I forget who it is, maybe Matthew Holmes, who's one of the kind of experts in the self-publishing field, marketing field, suggests, rightly so, you spend 80% of your effort on what sells 80% of your books. And it's not going to be the same for everything. You don't have to chase every new shiny thing. I think as an indie author, you need to know how to do all the tasks yourself so that if you later, like I have someone who does my Facebook and book club ads, or and Facebook ads and Amazon ads. She does it all far better than I can do it now. I'm rusty, but I know how. So I can supervise that sort of work. And I think I've a traditional PR firm representing you or a publicist may work in the nonfiction arena. I don't know. I think it is totally a waste of money in the for a
Mm.
novelist.
And I'll tell you, one of the things that I did, like literally just before we got on this call for my fourth novel, Casual Business with Fairies, that's coming out as we're recording. It's 8 weeks away. I had put together a list of indie bookstores in Alabama, where I am, and Georgia, and Mississippi, and Tennessee, which are all neighboring states. And so I just sent out an email to like 13 bookstores, indie bookstores saying, hey, you know, I've got a new book coming out. It's my fourth novel. Here's who I am. Here's some information about the book. I would love it if you would put it on your shelves. And if you're interested in doing some kind of author event, let's talk about that opportunity. Now,
Very
it took a while to put that information
fair.
together when I did it a couple
Yeah.
of years ago. But now I have the list. And so we'll see, who knows? So it's just another
Oh, you'll
thing
get
to
some.
try.
Yeah, you'll get some takers on those. That's for sure. And they're fun to do. I love live reader events. I haven't pursued much of that because at the end of the day, you have to sell quite a few books
Mm-hmm.
to make it profitable to spend your time in the drive. But there is something so satisfying about doing it that just a positive ROI isn't the only thing to consider. And I think you should do that. I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Well, I follow, David Ellis, who we've had on, and Robert Bailey on Instagram, and Robert Dugoni, and they do a lot of book club, Zoom book club events. There's no travel. It's that 30, 45, 60 minutes, whatever it is, that just drives a lot of fan relationship development and growth and all that sort of thing. But we have strayed from the original topic that I want to make sure that we
Yes,
cover
yeah,
plenty.
correct.
Um, and so my first book, my first nonfiction book under my given name was I thought of it as a devotional for lawyers, but like a business devotional, not spiritual devotional, of 5 minutes a day, these 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 words of just practical ideas to improve your law practice, particularly for younger lawyers. And I sold that book to the American Bar Association, which is the biggest publisher in the legal space, for that kind of thing. Had a good experience with them, but throughout that experience, and I had been blogging for a couple of years before I engaged in that, doing a ton of reading, like you mentioned, listening to a ton of podcasts about writing and publishing long before I had the intent to publish a book. But after that first book, I realized that I wanted more control over this process. I had a good experience with them, but I just wanted to control the whole thing. Um, and so I got ready to write the second book in 2019 and decided to do it on my own. They had the first right of refusal for that second book. We talked things through and realized we had different visions for how that was going to be marketed and priced and lots of things. So um, I was able to pursue that on my own. I did the same thing with the third book. And so, those first three books, for me, much of it was about control. And I had built an
Yeah.
audience through my law blog and through, Twitter, mostly Twitter at that point in time, for my given name, and just kind of building that slowly through communities that I was a part of with other lawyers. And I didn't blow it out with any of my sales, but they were consistent. I don't know. I'm really bad at keeping up with the numbers. I only keep up with the money and not the number of books.
Yeah.
But in that first year, that second book sold over 500 copies
Yeah.
through everything that I was putting into. So that was less than my goal, but still a number that I was pleased with.
Yeah.
And so when it came to writing novels, my approach remained the same. Of particularly with that first three, I knew that I could get this out there for other people. In 2020, I'm trying to think when it came out, another lawyer approached me who she had written a children's book. And or at that point, she had written a poem that she wanted to be a children's book. And she had a friend who was an artist. And so we talked about it and decided that I would publish that for her. And so I did that. So, I was comfortable enough with the process
Mhm.
after 3 years or so that I was now publishing for other people. And I'm getting ready. We talked to Claire
Mhm.
Parsons, several episodes ago, and I've got a children's book for her that I'm publishing. So, I'm just really comfortable with that process.
Mhm.
I'm working on my fifth novel. We've talked about it on here. And now for this fifth novel, I am reconsidering, and it's more than that, but I have decided to attempt to obtain an agent and sell it to
Mhm.
a publisher. And there's several reasons for that. But I have considered it a great deal, and it is a suspense novel. It's a
Mhm.
contemporary mystery novel, and those kinds of books are having a moment right now with books like The Guest List and things that have really just caught fire. And so it is much more commercially mainstream than the four fantasy novels that I've written before it. So
Yeah.
I know that it's commercially viable. So it's upmarket fiction that somebody would be interested in.
Mhm.
And I have done my homework on spending hours and hours finding agents who represent authors who I know of or know, um,
Yeah.
and produce this kind of work and represent this kind of work to get it out there, and then spent hours and hours and hours more working on a query letter that has to be changed every single time, because everybody's submission guidelines are different.
Yeah.
But what I have, with my fiction, my audience is much smaller than with my nonfiction because I was starting over with a new name and have kept that largely separate from my given name.
Mhm.
All that social media is different, mailing list is different, all of that. And so I think the biggest reason, everybody would love to have that one huge paycheck, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's the dream.
I agree.
Most people don't. That's not a reality. But what I really need help with is amplifying to a broader audience.
Mhm.
And I think that I can do that slowly, the way I am doing it, or if I can get it in front of the right, if I can get an agent who's interested
Mhm.
and get a publishing company who's interested, they can they can do that much more quickly than I can do it on my own.
Mhm. Yeah, if they and you're right. I've read the beginning of this book you're writing now, the commercial upmarket fiction one, and you're a terrific writer. That is a terrific premise. I think that's very viable. So I think you should go through the brain drain of getting an agent and seeing what happens. I have an agent. I was lucky enough to find her because the Rosemont series had done well. I think at the time we started working together, there were 5 books. She contacted me because she had been in-house at Audible. She had been an acquisitions editor at Audible, and then Sarah went out and formed her own agency and was soliciting people, clients, to sell their audio rights. And she sold everything I've done into the audio format for me, which has been wonderful. So we took a run at getting a traditional publisher for Guiding Emily, my guide dog book. Um, and people loved it, but everybody turned it down because a book with dog. They just didn't want to have a book with a dog voice, which has turned out to be fine because now I've sold the screen rights. And it's actually moving through the process. I believe it is going to be green lighted maybe in the next month. So, you just never know. I mean, you may just get out there and somebody will come to you.
Well, and I
It's
think that's so interesting, in some ways discouraging, but it's so interesting that someone with your sales track record, um, even had that difficulty. And so there's not always an accounting for what they're going to be interested in and not interested in,
Right.
regardless of the author's own
Yeah.
pedigree.
Particularly if you're a mid-lister, and I'm a mid-lister. So, um, yeah, you just don't know what to expect. Back, I don't know, 5 years ago, I wrote a thriller final circuit, and a decent big publisher was interested in it, and Sarah and I were going through it, and we both kind of came to the conclusion, a wonderful agent, because she didn't say, yes, do this because I'm going to make a bunch of money on you. She said, no, I think this isn't the right fit. Because the feedback, I had a protagonist with a speech impediment that played as part of the story. Um, and there was a cop that she was romantically involved in, but ultimately her own brilliance, which people discounted because they made assumptions about her due to her speech impediment, her own brilliance allows her to save herself. So publisher wanted me to get rid of the disability, and the cop saves her, saves the damsel in distress. She doesn't save herself. And I thought, well, that's a completely different book. And I'm not one of those authors who's like, oh, everything I've done is perfect, you can't change a thing. But this just struck me as really taking what I liked about the story and throwing it away. So that was something that I voluntarily turned down. And, I guess we'll never know whether I made the right decision, but I'm comfortable with it.
Well, and that's what it comes down to, right? These are business decisions.
Business decision.
Um,
Yes.
or at least in my opinion, they should be business decisions. I think there are people who want that stamp of approval
Yeah.
that feels like it comes along with being published by a traditional publisher. And there was a time for me that I thought that mattered. Um, it is not in any way a motivating factor for my reasoning now. And I'm not saying that's for better or worse. It's just
Mhm.
that's not what is driving my decision now. My decision is being driven basically by um, long term financial success for my fiction writing. Like, what serves that?
Yes.
Um, and that wasn't always the case. There was, and so that is now. That's how I see it. And these are business decisions. There are people who are detractors both one way or the other and say, indie publishing is terrible and only hacks do it, and others who are indie publishers and say it's the only way to go for everybody, because of the royalty percentage that you keep. And I certainly don't agree with either of those positions. And everybody's got to make the decision that best serves their own opportunities.
Yeah. I think that's very well said. And not just their opportunity, but their particular book, because the answer can be different for different kind of books, and that can change as well. I've had offers to publish the Rosemont series. Unfortunately, none of them. I was making more money on Rosemont than I would have gotten, and I'm like, well, why am I going to hand you a bunch of money? I'm doing fine. That doesn't mean that that won't be a different answer at a different point in time. I was just reading something online this morning from Nink, Novelists Incorporated. I was reading their newsletter, March newsletter, and one of the industry updates was that traditional publishers are going after popular books on TikTok, popular indie books on TikTok, and offering some decent deals. And a lot of that TikTok stuff is either spicy romance or fantasy, and sci-fi. And I was thinking about that for your first series of novels, because those TikTok might be the sweet spot for you. And so, you could very easily get discovered and end up trad published on that. It's it's not a matter of if you do indie publishing right, there's no difference in quality of the product you put out. You have to put money into it with editing, formatting, a good cover, all of that stuff is your obligation to turn out a decent product. Um, and you have to do some of your own marketing. So it isn't necessarily to turn out a better product, but it's to see what is going to be the most profitable way for you to basically distribute your book on your own or through a traditional publisher.
Yeah. And there is a thriller author, JD Barker, who is part of the Writers Inc. podcast. Um, and so I've been following him for several years now, and he is a hybrid author, and
Hmm.
he had books on his own. He's co-authored books with James Patterson, um, and he and his agent sit down and they have books that he is going to indie publish. They have books that he's going to submit traditionally, and if they don't get an offer that they like, because he knows how to sell it. He knows he can sell a lot of them. And so it has to be the right offer that makes sense for him to be able to take it. And so I think the idea of it depends on the book, it depends on the series, um, to make that decision. Another thing I was thinking about, and this will tie in with our interview that we had with Michael Laron and setting up an author estate, is there may come a time where you know an author needs to look and say, okay, this is what I can do now, but if I'm getting ready to retire from writing or preparing my estate, what are my heirs,
Yeah.
how are they going to want to deal with this? Are we better off with them just selling this to a traditional publisher,
Mhm.
and them just getting a royalty check, or is there somebody who wants to maintain this business?
Mhm. That's a valid point. I'm not going to mention her name, but an author friend who I don't know as well as some of my other cohort, but she's dearly beloved and unfortunately has a state was just diagnosed with a stage 4 brain tumor. She's on the talk. And shushing my husband off screen. And she's got a book that she was going to self-publish, and I think now they're thinking about the same thing about trad publishing it, um, so that her heirs don't have to mess with all of that. So that's a valid consideration. It would be lovely, wouldn't it, to say, okay, this is it, this is the path, these are the things you do, steps 1 through 10, and you're across the finish line. Unfortunately, it's a dynamic industry, as they all are, and every single project requires analysis as to how you want to finish it up.
Yeah, well, and even I had also heard the same thing about TikTok and the book publishers, and how they're looking at that
Yeah.
sort of thing. But that ecosystem of TikTok is so fragile too, because I
Yeah.
think there's going to be a lot of government regulation that gets involved in that. I wouldn't be surprised in coming months. So if it turns out that TikTok gets shut down in the United States, or
Yeah.
whatever, well, then that's gone, and there's going to be a new thing. There's all the
Yes.
upheaval with
Yes.
Twitter over the last few months. So
Yeah.
putting all of your, to be really cliche here, putting all your eggs into one basket and hoping that that is the solution for you, unless you own the basket, then
Yes.
it is subject to some change.
Yeah. Well, and exactly. And Carrie Oden pointed out that, her first series that she sold into a publisher, her editor, who she adored and who adored her, went to a different publishing house with a different focus. So they weren't interested in her historical fiction. The new editor at her old publishing house was not a fit,
Yeah,
so, for her and her work. So then she went through the brain drain of getting her rights back, and I think she found a new publisher, but um, it ain't easy. None of it is easy.
that's right. No
Yeah,
matter the path you choose, it's going to be fraught with potholes.
yeah, it is, and that's part of the fun of life, especially as lawyer writers, because we're problem solvers.
Mhm.
This is kind of in our wheelhouse, and contracts don't or shouldn't scare us. Um, so yeah, we just go
Yeah,
forward.
if I've got anything, it's ambition and tenacity. So
Yes, yes,
giving up is not something I, for better or worse. There have been times where I should have given up on things sooner, but that does not come easily for me.
no, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, stubborn as all get out.
Well, I think that's a talking about our own stubbornness is probably a good place to end the episode, and we will see what. I've got a few rejections come back already, from the ones that I sent out, knowing
Closer to
that's right.
yes.
That's right.
Yep.
Knowing that that was going to be the case.
Yeah.
3 of them were standard, just form rejections. One was personalized rejection. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes, and don't mind sharing both the successes and the failures here. And so we'll keep that updated too.
We all want to follow along. That's great.
All right. Well, thanks. And I will talk to you soon.
Talk to you later. Bye.